Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall Taylor, and we're so glad you can join us. There's been a flurry of activity on the Ukraine front. Over the weekend, Donald Trump met with Zelensky in Rome during ceremonies for Pope Francis's funeral. This encounter led to a rare rebuke of Putin by Trump, who suggested that the Russian leader might be tapping him along.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
Senator Lindsey Graham, sensing the opportunity, piled on by touting a recent bipartisan threat to impose more sanctions on Moscow. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio also stated on Sunday that the upcoming week would be very critical in determining whether the United States will continue participating in mediation efforts. In response, the Kremlin tried to shift the narrative, announcing a symbolic 3-day ceasefire for Victory Day, while still rejecting Trump's proposed 30-day truce. But just hours after that announcement, Russia launched 100 attack drones across Ukraine, killing a child and wounding several others. Meanwhile, Moscow is hardening its demands in many ways, with Foreign Minister Lavrov on Tuesday reiterating that Russia's proposal for a ceasefire insists on recognition of Crimea and occupied Ukrainian territory and refuses U.S. involvement in nuclear oversight. So, with U.S. frustration mounting, the major question now is how far a potential withdrawal will go. Will Washington merely walk away from the negotiating table, or would it be a more significant withdrawal of support for Ukraine? And so to get into these issues, we're very pleased to have with us Charlie Kupchan and Eric Ciaramella on the podcast today. Welcome to you both.
Good to be with you.
Thanks, Andrea.
Quick introductions. Charlie Kupchan is Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University. And Eric is a Senior Fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So, broad question maybe to the both of you, but Eric, we can start with you. Kind of how have you interpreted, understood the events over the past week? And as you're thinking about from both Ukraine and Russia's perspective, what would you say are the biggest kind of factors or considerations that both capitals have in mind as they're engaging and trying to navigate the Trump administration, understanding the urgency that Trump has so clearly expressed about bringing the war to a rapid end?
Thanks. Well, I think we've all been on this roller coaster of diplomatic campaign by President Trump and his advisors to push for a ceasefire. There was this whole talk of the sort of 100-day mark, which is, this week, that he wanted a ceasefire within that time. And some of his advisors, I think even a few weeks ago, were pretty bullish about that prospect. But what it seems to me is that the administration is gradually coming to realize that this war is indeed much more complicated than they had anticipated, and that the interests and objectives of the sides are, if not entirely mutually exclusive, at least very significantly so. And so the possibility of just kind of waving their hands or blustering their way into a ceasefire is just not going to work. And no amount of, cajoling or tweeting or kind of bombastic statements is just going to sort of magically compel the parties to sort of stop fighting, because they're doing so for, very significant systemic reasons. Ukraine for an existential defense of the homeland from a foreign invader, and Putin at this point, in a way, existential for him now that his entire regime has kind of reconstituted itself around the war effort and, the war economy. And so it's hard for the Russians to stop fighting too. So I think there is this gradual realization. What I will say about the diplomacy, we've had a series of very low points. Probably the Oval Office spat being the lowest of the low between Trump and Zelensky. Things started to get better in the subsequent weeks as we saw the rounds of talks happening in Saudi Arabia, particularly the U.S.-Ukraine channel, where I think there was a real start to a conversation about modalities of long-term security arrangements, of a ceasefire, what would actually work so that this wouldn't just be a ceasefire on paper, but would actually stop the fighting. But against that backdrop, we've also seen this parallel process of the U.S.-Russia channel being led by the president's envoy, Steve Witkoff, including several visits to Moscow and one-on-one meetings with Putin, where the messages out of there strike me as, overly credulous about what it is that Putin's willing to give and the flexibility on the Russian side and the Russian willingness to make peace. And so I think it creates a lot of expectations that, peace is in the offing and the Russians are being constructive, when in fact, when you look at what's actually going on the ground and the missile strikes and all of that, the Russians are not really showing any inclination to budge whatsoever on what are still their maximalist objectives. So, just final kind of thoughts on the last week. We were headed towards what could have been a disaster in the round of talks in London when we had the reporting about the so-called final offer that the Trump administration had made to the Ukrainians, which involved, as you were referencing, legal recognition of Crimea as Russian territory, lifting of sanctions, Europeans leading some sort of security arrangement, so on and so forth. But again, not having much meat on the bones beyond that. And then Secretary of State Rubio and then envoy Steve Witkoff pulled out of the talks at the last minute, which sent a very kind of confusing and disturbing signal, with the reporting being that Ukraine wasn't willing to move on Crimea. To me, that's not the central issue. We can talk about that a little bit more, but I think we were headed for a catastrophe, and the Ukrainians and the Europeans kept a very level head, and I think managed to have what I understand to be a very constructive round of technical level meetings. The president's other envoy, retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, was there in London and met with a variety of European and Ukrainian officials. And they were talking one level deeper about the details of ceasefire and security and all of that. And from what I understand, again, I'm not in the room. We're only kind of piecing together and reading the tea leaves, that there actually was a lot of substantive alignment on some of the details related to security. And so the sides, let's say the sides on the Allied side, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, the Americans, are actually not as far apart as it might seem if you're just reading the wave tops on Twitter. And as you mentioned rightly in your opening, it does seem like Trump is starting to get annoyed with Putin's foot dragging. And so the question now is whether we're at the beginning of a bit of a strategic turning point in the diplomacy towards something that's going to look a bit tougher on Russia, or if this is just part of Trump's kind of general maneuvering and jockeying in the talks, and then we'll wake up tomorrow and there will be some tirade against Zelensky. It's very hard to know.
Charlie, pick that up. I mean, where do you think we're headed? Is this a turning point in U.S. diplomacy? Can you imagine a harder line coming out of the Trump administration? I mean, I also mentioned in the intro this Lindsey Graham announcement that they've got this sanctions package in the ready, but Republicans don't seem to have really, piped up too much to weigh in on Trump's approach so far. So I guess, can you imagine a tougher line, or do you think, as many do, and I would put myself in this camp, that the Trump administration is getting ready to kind of pack up and remove itself, at least from the diplomatic process?
Let me answer that by backing up a little bit and just kind of giving you a sense of where I'm coming from, and that is that I think Trump is doing the right thing by opening a direct channel to Putin, and by having his team meet with Russians, whether it's in Moscow or Saudi Arabia. I'm someone who has believed that this war needs to come to an end at the negotiating table. I wish it had happened under the Biden administration, because I think they would have done a better job. But the effort is overdue. That having been said, it's been a mess. It's been chaos since the beginning, going back to the week before the Munich Security Conference. And so it's been very, very poorly handled. And what the Trump administration should have done is sit down with the Ukrainians and European allies and forged a plan, forged what is considered to be an acceptable end game for those parties, and then start negotiating with the Russians. But by going over the heads of the Ukrainians and trying to cut a deal with Putin and then forcing it down their throats, it really has just been a mess. That having been said, I think right now we're at a place where some progress has been made. I wouldn't say we should throw in the towel, and I wouldn't say that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I think we just don't know. The deal that seems to be emerging between Trump and Putin has, in my mind, certain assets, certain things that are where they should be, which is number one, a freeze in place, because I think that's how we're going to get to a ceasefire. And number two, a recognition that, at least for now, those parts of Ukraine that are occupied by Russia are probably going to stay occupied by Russia for the foreseeable future. What's missing from the conversation, and maybe it's happening behind closed doors, but it hasn't yet come out into the public, is the other side of the equation. And that is, what are the conditions that Putin is demanding when it comes to what happens on the other side of that line? And, his maximalist demands are non-starters: demilitarization, neutrality, no more weapons from the West to Ukraine, rolling back the post-Cold War order. If that's where he is, then forget it. But it may be that we're making some progress on that front. And in my own mind, the definition of success that we should aim for is a deal that leaves the 80% of Ukraine that is still free a success story, able to make its own decisions about its future, getting aid, economic and military, from the West, finding a pathway toward membership in the European Union. In other words, a country that is out from under the thumb of Russia. How close we are to that deal, I don't know. Finally, to come to your question, I think that we're seeing frustration in Washington. Trump wanted a win in his first 100 days, and he doesn't have any. Not with Russia, not with Israel and Hamas, not with Iran, not with China, not with anybody. And I think you're seeing frustration. And I do think that he could tighten the screws on Russia if he believes that he is basically being taken for a ride and that Putin is not negotiating in good faith. But right now, I would say everything is kind of up in the air. We need to see the next 2 or 3 steps before getting a good sense of where we are.
But what reason do you think the Trump administration would have to believe that they're not being taken for a ride? It seems fairly clear to most people from the outside, and obviously President Trump has finally hinted that might be the case. But do you see any evidence that the Russians are in any way serious about moving things forward?
I need to know more about what Putin is saying about the other side of the line, right? And if he still has in mind regime change, and he has in mind a Ukraine that is strategically exposed and therefore effectively subjugated to the whims of the Kremlin until the end of time, no. But I don't have a good sense as to where Putin's is on those issues. And until we hear otherwise, I'm sort of where Eric is, which is that we need to know that he has changed his tune, moving from maximalist war aims to a different view, which would be, this war's over. I've got a chunk of 4 oblasts plus Crimea, mission accomplished.
Well, thanks to both of you. I appreciate that wrap up, and I agree with your views. And Charlie, just a quick question for you. I would think that Putin declaring that the war is over, I've reached my goals, part of that would have to be something that gives him, and you alluded to this, something that gives him reason to believe he can kind of call the shots in Kyiv. In other words, regime change would be one side of it, but I can't see him walking away from this war without being able to feel that he can call the shots in Kyiv. That just seems to be one of the reasons he set off on this adventure to begin with, and that he will not go to the table unless he can figure out some way in which they can denazify, i.e., that he can feel that he can call the shots there. Would you say that's the case, or is that really not as big a goal as it might have been one time?
Yeah, I mean, that's where he started, and that may be where he is. And I'm hoping that behind closed doors, the U.S. is saying to him that unless you give up on those aspirations, this war is going to go on for a very long time. Is Putin someone who is completely immune to incoming information? Maybe, right? Maybe he still lives in this delusion that Ukraine is going to come home to mama, and that behind every Ukrainian is a wannabe Russian. And as long as we liberate those wannabe Russians from the Nazi regime, then they're going to retake their place as in our family. Uh, at some point, you would think he would get it, right? That he has completely alienated all of Ukraine's or 99% of Ukraine's population. They want nothing to do with Russia. And that 80% of Ukraine that is still free is gone for good. Now, is he ever going to face up to that? I don't know.
Eric, you want to weigh in on that? But one point, Charlie, on the is the Trump administration telling them otherwise behind the scenes? I have little confidence that they are, because for a period there, the Trump administration was also on the bandwagon of calling for elections before an end to the fighting. So it just seemed like they too had adopted those Russian demands that would help and facilitate Russia orchestrate this so-called kind of regime change. So I don't have a lot of confidence that they're pushing those messages and instead have adopted many of those positions as their own.
The only comeback I would offer is that if the Trump administration wants to see this come to an end successfully, they need Ukraine to say yes. They need Europe to say yes. And so even though Trump may not really care about the future of Ukraine, if he wants a deal, he needs Zelensky. And as a consequence, they may be coming around to a Ukrainian position because it's the only way to get to the finish line.
Yeah. Eric, you want to weigh in, and especially on the Putin aim objective? I mean, you kind of hinted at this in your first answer about what this is really about. So over to you kind of on that important point. Do you think that Putin still believes that he will be able to call the shots in Kyiv? And is his only way to do this through kind of on the battlefield? Or, I mean, I guess that the question to me is also, is there a world in which Putin can take enough and believe that once you end the war, hold elections, that there's other ways that they can accomplish their aims, after the end of a war as well?
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, that would be my read of the most kind of optimistic scenario. So my baseline assumption is that Putin hasn't changed his overall objectives at all. But that his analysis of the means to achieve them is flexible and has been flexible all along, whether it's military pressure, whether it's other forms of pressure. Right now, he thinks that continuing to grind away at the Ukrainian army on the battlefield is the best course of action, because he thinks that, Western support is dwindling and will at some point reach zero, or at least on the American side will reach zero. Europeans will keep arming, but not to the level that the United States has been able to, and that he'll be able to crack the backbone of the Ukrainian army at some point. The question is whether Trump can get Putin into a place where he thinks that a ceasefire not only won't damage Russia's chances of achieving its objectives over the medium term, let's say, but could provide him new tools. And this is where the game of diplomacy works. You know, you have to kind of convince both parties that a pause, an indefinite pause, will work to their advantage. Our responsibility as the United States, I think, because we're not neutral parties, despite what Trump has been saying, I mean, we have a clear and compelling interest to see Ukraine able to defend itself. Our mission will be to ensure that Ukraine is able to make the best use of a ceasefire period and rearm and fortify and prepare for another onslaught and create deterrence mechanisms and all of that. But to achieve the initial ceasefire, I do believe there are ways to convince Putin that he can get what he wants through that means anyway. And so my inclination, you know, again, if I were sort of advising Witkoff or Trump, I would say stop trying to bring all these other bigger political issues in, like de jure recognition of territory, and these are kind of like war terminating like things that are off in the distance. Focus on the ceasefire part of it, get to the ceasefire, and then you can start the political negotiations after that and come up with a plan to secure Ukraine in the meantime, with maybe Europe in the lead and America supporting behind the scenes. And, you know, what's in it for Putin at that point? Why would he stop fighting? I think that there is value in the Trump factor, in that Putin really does see Trump as a once in a generation type of American leader who wants to do business with Russia, get along with Russia, all this kind of stuff that Trump usually says. And, you know, Putin doesn't want to squander that opportunity in its entirety. And if he gives nothing and is completely inflexible, then he potentially loses Trump's entire second term early on. So Putin may be able to make the calculation in his mind, all right, I'm going to agree to this pause. We're not getting really what we want in the long-term objectives. I still have my maximalist aims, but I'm going to just lay low and rearm during the ceasefire period and then go at it again in a few years if we can't get what we want through negotiations. Meanwhile, we're all racing to rearm. And the picture probably will look different in 2-3 years. And Ukraine will be, hopefully, if we act correctly, us and the Europeans will be fortified, rearmed, reconstituted, rested, and much more capable of deterring and, if necessary, repelling another attack.
I just want to highlight a point that Eric just made, Andrea, because it comes back to a question you asked a few minutes ago, which is, are there any signs that Putin is changing his mind? And I think if there's anything that can change his mind, or at least get him to adjust his position, it is the prospect of building a relationship with Trump. Right? Trump can offer him something that no one else can, and that is sort of coming in from the cold, having summits with the American president, re-engaging, perhaps getting the sanctions down, although I think that's going to be difficult when it comes to the European side. But, you know, Trump is in some ways Putin's only pathway to rehabilitation. And so I wouldn't kind of minimize the draw of that when it comes to perhaps inducing his flexibility.
Talk a little bit about this, because we've heard a lot. It's the topic of the moment is this like reverse Nixon, reverse Kissinger, whatever you want to call it. I mean, so how do you think Putin sees Trump in that sense? You know, you call the pathway to rehabilitation, I think is an excellent way to put it, because it, to me, connotes more of kind of immediate short-term advantages. But how all in would Putin be in trying to restore relations with the United States? I guess this is the flip side of trying to ask is, do you think that Washington's overtures to Putin are an effective way to get them to stop the relationship with China, the relationship with Iran, the other things that many people have talked about as driving this approach to Russia?
There's a lot of talk that that's what's going on here. I don't see it that way. I think this is really about he wants to end the war. He doesn't want to keep sending billions of dollars of weapons to Ukraine. He wants a win. Furthermore, if they did believe that this was a way of separating Russia and China or getting Russia to change its tune, then they're living in la la land because it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Right? I think the Russia-China connection is pretty durable. Would the Russians like a little bit more flexibility? Would they be able to be able to triangulate once in a while? Yes. But is this a play that's really about fundamentally altering Russia's foreign policy? No way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let's change the parameter here and include the Europeans in all this. It's been watching them scramble from the very beginning to try to be a player, to have a seat at the table, has been I don't know, hard to watch. They should be part of this. I mean, their sanctions are biting into Putin. They do SWIFT, and that's what the Russians really want to have lifted. They have jumped into this idea of a reassurance force. They're now trying to calculate, can they really actually do it? Particularly if this goes on for a long time. And what will it really do? And will Russia test it? And if they test it, it would be a real horrible thing if they failed that test and began to run back home. Someone said it'd be like the UN in Srebrenica. Is that what would happen to them? So they're still in there playing. They've gotten a little quiet of late after some pretty tough talk about Putin. So where are they now in this? They're at the table every now and then for technical talks. London, of course, we were just talking about that. But if you were Macron or if you're Keir Starmer, what would you be doing? So in a sense, what's happening now with them, and where do you think they should go? What should their moves be if you were in their shoes? Eric, what do you think?
Well, I think on the diplomatic side, the Europeans have played this decently well. They had a really tough hand with the double whammy of the J.D. Vance speech in Munich and then the Oval Office debacle with Zelensky. And Macron and Starmer managed to put the train back on the tracks relatively quickly by kind of doing this shuttle marriage counseling between Kyiv and Washington. And getting the suspension of aid lifted, particularly on the intel side, which was critical. I think on a strategic level, what they have done since Trump took office that they were not willing to do under Biden was to realize that they have a fundamentally common objective with Ukraine and that they need to come up with a joint vision for some sort of lasting peace together with the Ukrainians. And I think that they have somewhat succeeded, at least in the different formats of talks, in kind of convincing the United States, as Charlie was saying, that like, if you want peace, ultimately you do need Ukraine and Europe to agree. And so they've managed to get themselves sort of, not a seat at the table yet, but at least a seat in the room. They're part of the conversation now. On the reassurance force, I agree. It's been very hard to watch. I had hopes initially that they were going to be able to come through with something, sizable, maybe not substantial. I never thought there was going to be a classical peacekeeping operation, on the line of contact, separation force, nothing like that, a deterrence force, but at least some sort of, tailored reassurance mission in the kind of 10,000 range. Even that seems like a stretch for them. It was good that the Brits brought in the Turks to the conversation, into the tent. So this is not just kind of an EU plus UK thing. Turkey having the second largest military in NATO, and probably going to play a significant maritime role for Black Sea security and shipping going forward. So that was a good move. But I think, they're a bit of the dogs who caught the car on this, where they talked a big game about this force, and then there was kind of some interest in this, and then the planning discussion started, and there's really no common, even between the French and the British, understanding of what the mandate and the scope of such a mission would be. So I don't think it's dead. I think there are still discussions, and the silence is probably actually a good thing, because it means that they're still talking through the technical details behind the scenes. But I think where we land is probably going to be something that looks a bit more like a training and advising mission, with a really tailored in-country presence focused on um, helping Ukrainians absorb and learn how to use European equipment more effectively, probably intelligence support, maybe some kind of force management support, and some, billets detailed to the general staff, and on the new core structures that the Ukrainians are creating to help, to boost kind of also morale in the Ukrainian armed forces, where there's some concerns about, certain commanders in the force not really making the smartest kind of operational decisions. It's pretty varied across the force, and you get some European presence there, kind of as a second line of review in some of the operational decisions that could give a little bit more confidence in those who are being mobilized, that like there are going to be smart decisions made. But I think you're going to end up with something on the order of a few thousand kind of trainers and advisors in the country. I think that's still a good outcome. I think that's still a good outcome, so long as the brunt of the European long-term support for Ukraine is still coming in the form of additional weapons production, and direct funding for the Ukrainian defense industry, following the model that Denmark set, because Ukraine still has tremendous excess capacity to produce a wide array of weapons, not only ammunition, but also, certain systems. They can't do kind of the advanced air defense like Patriots that really only we can provide. And they're making progress on kind of some of the ballistic missiles and other kind of long range deterrence capabilities. But that's all expensive and technically challenging. But again, I think the Ukrainians, in combination with the Europeans sort of pouring money into rearmament, can get there uh, in this broader objective of turning Ukraine into this impenetrable fortress.
Charlie, is it enough?
I mean, I'm in broad agreement with Eric. I think the Europeans have handled this pretty well, in the sense of staying in the game and engaging as much as possible with the Trump administration on the contents of a peace deal. I'm struck by the degree to which a lot of Europeans, not so much the European leaders, but a lot of analysts, and you see this a lot in the press, they think it's over, right? You have this kind of sense in Europe that American democracy is finished and the Atlantic Partnership is gone, and it's time for us to ride off on our own. And I would caution against that. Is this going to be a bumpy era? Yes. Do I think Trump is going to pull out of NATO? No, because I don't see much in it for him. Um, the other point I'd make here is that I think that Europeans have a very compelling interest in keeping the U.S. in this game, because if Trump, when he says, if I don't get a deal, I'm walking away, that may well mean not just walking away from a peace deal, but walking away from Ukraine. And maybe 10 years from now, maybe 15 years from now, Europe will be able to fill the gap, because they're starting to spend more on defense. They're starting to invest in a defense industrial base. But if the United States really walks away from Ukraine and turns off the spigot, no more weapons, no more money, no more intel, I'm very worried about Ukraine. And I do think that the one constraint on that is I don't think Trump wants to go down in history as the American president who lost Ukraine. And I'm hoping that Europeans and Ukrainians are telling him that.
So, I mean, the hardest question is then, I mean, if the Europeans need to keep the US in some way, shape, or form, as do the Ukrainians, because certainly US involvement puts Ukraine in a better position, then how do we think about the Trump deal that's on the table? Is it the best deal that Ukraine is going to get? Are they going to have to accept the international, accept that Crimea belongs to Russia now? I mean, because if the risk is that the United States will walk, and as you said rightfully, Charlie, it could include the intelligence support and other things that the US does, and Ukraine and Europe want to continue fighting, is it possible that they would ever find themselves in a stronger position than they are today? Or, do they keep fighting and only find themselves in a worse position later?
I think that scenario is extremely risky, in part because the politics of this are wobbly in Europe as they are here, right? If you look at political trends in France and Germany, right, political centers are eroding. National Rally is polling at the top. AFD, Alternatives for Germany, gains. So I'm not even sure that you have a political consensus in Europe to keep this up for the indefinite future. And so, yeah, the bottom line, Andrea, is that if this deal, as I said earlier, enables the 80% of Ukraine that's still free to get on with life, then yes, this is a good deal and the Ukrainians should take it. On Crimea, I don't think the United States should recognize Crimea as part of Russia. But I do think that the idea that Ukraine, for now, has to say goodbye to the 20% of the land that's occupied by Russia, that's just pragmatism. It is a violation of international law. We have to hold our nose when we say that, but it's the reality.
But the deal is international recognition.
My reading of the deal is that it's U.S. recognition of Crimea. Okay. And it doesn't ask Ukraine to do it, and it doesn't ask Europe to do it. I'm opposed to U.S. recognition, but I wouldn't fall on my sword. If we could get this deal and the only thing that was left was U.S. recognizing Crimea as part of Russia, I'd probably say, hold your nose and do it.
Assuming we could address some of the issues that you said before on what happens, on the...
Only assuming.
Yeah.
Without that, I wouldn't touch this deal.
Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was useful for Trump to clarify that he wasn't asking Ukraine to recognize. I think it's impossible for Ukraine, not only politically, but constitutionally. It's just, it is fundamentally impossible for them to recognize the loss of their own territory. I guess I'm kind of with Charlie. I think it's a terrible U.S. policy to do it, but if for some reason that ends up being the sticking point, then Trump can do it and a future president can reverse it, because presidents have executive authority to recognize and unrecognize and do whatever they want. Not without limits, but pretty close to without limits. The bigger thing is that, I still don't think that this is the main issue for the Russians. And so...
it wasn't really at the top of their list before, right?
Exactly.
That's something that, as the U.S. has been willing to make concessions, has now been added as their position is hardened, given where the U.S. has come in.
I kind of see this particular issue of Crimea as something that some Americans put onto the list because they thought it would work with the Russians, but it wasn't something the Russians were really asking for. So, I guess on the overall frame, I'm with Charlie that if there is some sort of contour of a deal where it's sort of de facto, you just freeze the lines, and then Ukraine will get some kind of long-term kind of commitments of support, certain amount of European presence, even if it's tailored. And then again, the fighting stops for, let's hope, an extended period of time. I think that's a decent deal, even if the fundamental political issues aren't resolved. And I think it's doable if Trump sort of projects a little bit more staying power in his sort of strategy of recognizing that the Ukrainians need to be able to stand on their own 2 feet with external backing, and that like there isn't an interest in completely eviscerating Ukraine's self-defense capacity, because that doesn't lead to any kind of stable peace. So again, I don't know that we're on the verge of reaching a deal like that, but I do think it's possible.
So as you both have recognized rightfully that like what the United States is willing to do for Ukraine and Europe in terms of allowing Ukraine to protect itself in the future still seems to be the very unclear and outstanding question. It's not clear how that factors into Trump's, quote unquote, final proposal. There is the mention that Europe would be responsible for the security guarantees. But to in this Trump plan, what could you imagine? Like, what do you think that Trump and the United States under Trump will be willing to do for Ukraine in order to defend itself in the future? Like, Charlie, what can you imagine? Like, what do you think's on offer?
Well, one of the things that's taking place behind the scenes as we speak is apparently a top Ukrainian official is flying to Washington to try to conclude the minerals deal. And I think that would help, because one of the main talking points of Trump advance when they were campaigning was, none of it, we're just giving away the store. And if they can strike a deal whereby Trump can say, okay, I'm going to give X billion dollars in weapons to Ukraine, but they're going to pay us back through this minerals fund, I think it solves one of his political challenges at home, which is in some ways to reverse what he said he was going to do. And if the war does end and the Ukrainians are using the inflow of aid to build up as opposed to expending it on the battlefield right away, then their needs go down over time. And so I could imagine a world in which Trump, if he gets a ceasefire and he gets the minerals deal, is willing to go to Congress and to say, I need $15 billion to send Patriots and other things that they need. And this is not on our dime anymore, because we have access to this fund that's drawing on resources, minerals, oil, blah, 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 blah. So that to me is not out of the question. And I do think if the deal is signed, and apparently there's some language in there, nothing about strategic guarantees or security guarantees, but this brings the U.S. into strategic alignment with Ukraine. That's as good as you're going to get, right? Trump's never going to go beyond strategic alignment, but it does give this administration a bit more of a stake in ensuring that if this war does end, that what's left of Ukraine is a going concern.
Well, I guess back to the security guarantee question then. We talked about the reassurance force, which certainly isn't a security guarantee. We talk about the minerals deal, which is certainly not a security guarantee, despite U.S. business being involved at some point in the future. Is there anything in the future that we think that Zelensky can point to when he goes back to Kyiv and say, "I've brought a security guarantee"? NATO, it looks like, is not going to be on the docket. Maybe EU membership will. We read every now and then that Putin is saying, "Oh, sure, I'll let them join the European Union." So what are we going to do about a security guarantee? Do a Budapest memorandum again, or Eric?
I mean, I think at this point, no Ukrainians are really expecting a security guarantee in a classical sense from the United States or even from Europe. And I think what we're in the zone of here is understanding that Ukraine's own indigenous capabilities and manpower will be the main deterrent force,
Right.
both in terms of denial and punishment, and that long-term commitments to finance, equip, train, produce weapons for, provide intel support to that armed forces that will be in the country is the best form of a guarantee. And you hear this in some Ukrainian leaders' sort of views that, we can only really count on ourselves and the
Right.
Ukrainian armed forces.
Yeah.
So I do think you can come up with a structure of commitments and agreements that make substantial progress towards kind of codifying that long-term support. Even if it's over the 10-year duration of these bilateral security agreements, of which Ukraine has signed 24 with NATO allies, including the United States. Those were started under the previous administration, but those kind of provide the policy structure for this kind of dedicated long-term conversation about training and equipping. I think you can make those a little bit more robust, both like legally speaking, but also putting the dollars and cents behind them. This innovation of the Danish model, I think, is significant. Other countries are gravitating towards it now. I do think that the intelligence support can continue. Andrea, your initial question about, in this scenario, what might Trump agree to continue? I mean, the intel support is relatively cheap by American defense standards, and we get an enormous amount out of the relationship with Ukraine. So I would not be surprised if that continues, probably on a, in a quiet way, and it's not being touted, but it's critical for Ukraine. But again, we get an amazing insights from them about how Russia wages war and so on and so forth. That's invaluable for our own defenses. So I think you can knit these things together. But it's not going to be a classical security guarantee, Article 5, we're coming across the line the next day as soon as a shot is fired. I don't think that's realistic right now where we are in this geopolitical moment.
Charlie, anything you want to add? And I guess at the crux of the question is, do you feel optimistic that we, from where we are right now, can get to some place where you can imagine an end to the war and a place where Ukraine, in the relatively near term, will feel confident that Russia doesn't try again? I mean, I guess that's what Eric is trying to sketch out, of what will it take to get to a lasting peace. Can you imagine that, right, sitting where we are today, that Ukraine will, with its own indigenous capabilities and some long-term support from Western backers, get to a place where they will be able to successfully deter future Russian aggression?
Yes, I mean, I'm sort of where Eric is, which is that they're not going to get the security guarantee that they want, which is a NATO Article 5, and they may get a formal security guarantee through Article 42.7 in the EU treaty, but that's going to take a long time. And so the best that they can do in the meantime is to use these bilateral security deals and the goodwill of the United States and other countries to keep providing the assistance that they need to enable Ukraine to defend itself. Because, as Eric said, that's the best deterrent, and the best defense is making sure that Ukraine has a strong and capable army. And I do imagine that if we got a deal, that there would be a demilitarized zone. Ideally, you would have some kind of international force in there that would monitor, and you'd have cameras and all kinds of electronic equipment to monitor this. And so I don't think it's pie in the sky. Where my kind of assessment of the likelihood has been going down over time because the negotiations have not been well handled. And I think that Trump needs to put more pressure on the Russians. Up till now, it's been mostly carrots and not many sticks. And I think they need more. They need more sticks. I think there's a reasonable chance that we will get a ceasefire. I wouldn't say that we're going to get a peace deal. My best guess is that we would get some kind of new frozen conflict in which there's a line of contact, there's a zone of separation or demilitarized zone. The Ukrainians rearm, the Russians rearm, and we hope that what we're seeing now is the last round of Russian aggression against Ukraine.
If I could just throw out one more question. So, we look at what you were saying, Charlie. You're looking into the future, what you hope to see. It might be a frozen conflict with hopefully it's staying frozen, it's a Korea kind of thing, maybe, or, whatever analogy you might draw for something that's as complex as this. So let's just say that we get that. What happens next after the fighting in Ukraine dies down? There's a frozen conflict. It's kind of quiet, but the Russian military engine is going full tilt, and so is the wartime economy. They haven't demobilized this new military that they've created. So what's the next step? What does Russia do then? And I don't want you to be too far out in the woods on something like this, but the Wall Street Journal seems to think that that they're not going to stop just with Ukraine. So, where are you two on that? What happens when things get quiet in Ukraine, but the Russians aren't demobilizing? In fact, they're staying right where they are, if not getting bigger militarily. What do you think?
And openly flaunting their relations with North Korea and all of it.
And this is the fourth year of Trump, and he's moved on to other things, and maybe he's got a deal going with Russia on some kind of rare earths. But what do you think Putin does with a military that size, battle hardened, drones, all that? What's his next move? Or does he do anything? Maybe he demobilizes and becomes a Jeffersonian democracy. What happens?
I think the Russia that we see now is the Russia we will have as long as Putin is alive and in power. And as a consequence, I think we're looking at a redivided Europe with a new front line that's a lot longer than the old front line because Finland is now a member, and we may get some arms control negotiations. We may get agreements about this, that, and the other thing, as we did in the Cold War. But I think we're gonna have to kind of settle in for the long haul here. And I expect Putin to do what he's done in Ukraine elsewhere because that's his game. That's what he does, and that's one of the reasons that I don't think NATO's finished and that the United States is going to withdraw. Because in that world where Putin remains a tough customer, even if he has a good relationship with Trump, even if we bring down some of the sanctions, I think there will be a compelling case that U.S. troops need to stay in Europe, maybe at lower numbers, but stay in Europe, in the eastern flank countries for the foreseeable future.
So no Narva grab.
No what?
No Narva grab. That scenario about Narva and Little
Well,
Green Men.
No, I don't think that's particularly likely. I don't think it ever really has been, so long as Article 5 is still credible, which I think it is. I mean, if you get a really substantial change of U.S. policy that fundamentally undermines and weakens Article 5, then yeah, things might be on the table that are currently impossible. But Putin doesn't want a war with NATO. No way. So I think that we're likely to see a Russia that is, more acting like a rogue actor in terms of proliferation of technologies to countries like North Korea and Iran, doing, all this kind of mischief that they've been doing in Europe, assassinations, sabotage, going after critical infrastructure. That's going to be the new normal. And I think Charlie's right. The Russia we have is the Russia we're going to deal with for the foreseeable future. And so we just have to sort of buckle up for what's going to be a very, very challenging long-term threat. But at least the hope would be that in this scenario, the conventional large-scale warfare in Europe would be over. And we could, we're better equipped to deal with sort of hybrid threats, hopefully. But I don't think Putin is going to rearm and attack a NATO ally again, unless Trump does something that fundamentally weakens Article 5.
Yeah, and this is a good teaser for our upcoming paper, Jim, on also implications of a Indo-Pacific scenario. I mean, your point, Eric, is basically about how Putin perceives like the credibility of Article 5, but also NATO's capabilities. And if the United States significantly and rapidly downsizes its commitment, its presence in Europe, or if for reasons because we're engaged in the Indo-Pacific, then Putin might perceive more of an opportunity. But so there'd have to be other conditions, I think, that create a more conducive environment from Putin's perspective. But and I mean, I know Jim's scenario was predicated kind of on an end to the war in Ukraine, and it's definitely worth underscoring how the war ends will also really significantly matter, I think, for what Putin looks to do in Europe next.
Right.
Well, this was a slightly more, I hesitate to use the word optimistic, but it was a slightly more optimistic conversation than I was expecting to have. And I think it was a really excellent conversation. So I thank you both, Charlie and Eric, for joining us, and hope we can do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you for hosting. It's good to see everybody.
Thanks,
Good to see you,
Andrea.
Charlie.
You too.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.